Hello, brave listeners, and welcome to Phantom Fables, your safe haven for chilling tales and eerie wonders. Tonight, we venture into the haunting corridors of an old mansion, where every flicker of light reveals a shadowy terror. Be aware, he is no ordinary tale, only a journey to the dark unknown. The shadow flickers and maintains an ominous presence, even if out of sight, and those who dare to uncover the mystery behind it have to face their darkest nightmares. This is the ominous account of the Flickering Shadow. 1587, Erzurum, Ottoman Empire. The pale moon was painted low over the city of Erzurum, its glow casting eerie shadows on the cobblestone streets. The ancient town, set in the Anatolian highlands, was silent at night, as if the city itself was afraid of the darkness. The townsfolk spoke of the mountains beyond the city walls, a place avoided by all but the most daring or the most foolish. Among the legends of these mountains was the Flickering Shadow, a ghostly figure which, according to legend, appeared every 100 years, dispelling depression and craziness. Abdiahu was an antiquities scholar who had heard the stories when he was a child in the distant city of Saft. He had paid them no mind, thinking them just the prattling of old men. As he grew older and began reading ancient texts, however, he began to uncover fragments of a darker truth. The shadow was not a tale, it was a curse, one tied to a powerful artifact lost in the mists of time. Now he was standing in Erzurum, surrounded by the dim flicker of an oil lamp in a stench-ridden tavern, his fingers trailing around the edges of the worn map spread on the table before him. "This is madness," whispered Shlomith, his longtime companion and confidant. Her voice trembled as she glanced around the nearly empty room. "The locals fear the mountain for a reason. What you're chasing might not be worth the cost." Abdiahu did not lift his eyes. His eyes seemed to pierce through the map, thinking about all that it might represent. "If the shadow is real," he said, his voice steady, "then it is not a curse alone. It is the key to unlocking something much bigger. Legends are based on truth, Shlomith." The creaking sound of the heavy door was what stopped her from answering. A gust of wind blew into the tavern, and it flapped open. In came a man dusted with snow. He had been cloaked, and his name was Yehoash. He was Abdiahu's hired guide for the journey to the mountains. "So you're still set on this?" Yehoash growled. "Even the villagers think you're barmy. I think they might be right." He folded the map and stood. "You're getting paid to guide us, not to question my sanity." Yehoash cracked a sardonic grin. "Fair enough. But don't say I didn't warn you when the mountain takes what it always does." At dawn, the group set out, Abdiahu, Shlomith, Yehoash, and 2 others, Reuben, a skilled swordsman, and Gad, a young but eager apprentice to Abdiahu. The path to the mountains was treacherous, winding through dense forests and icy ravines. The air grew colder with each passing mile, and an unnatural silence seemed to envelop the group. As he climbed higher, Abdiahu couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. Shadows danced at the periphery of his vision, but when he turned, nothing was there. "Do you feel it?" Shlomith whispered, pausing to rest. "Feel what?" Reuben asked, his hand instinctively resting on the hilt of his sword. "The air," she replied. "It's heavy, like it's alive." Reuben laughed. "It's just nerves. The mountain isn't evil, it's just a mountain." Abdiahu wasn't convinced. The farther they climbed, the more the stories seemed to crowd upon him. He remembered a sentence from a piece of an old manuscript he'd read. "Beware the flickering shadow, for it is neither of the living nor the dead. It feeds on fear and despair, and its touch leaves nothing but emptiness." By the second night, they had reached the base of the mountain. They camped in the lee of a rocky outcrop, the fire casting long, flickering shadows on the snow-covered ground. The wind howled through the trees, carrying with it an unsettling whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. As the group huddled around the fire, Yehoash told stories of past expeditions. "No one who's gone beyond this point has ever returned," he said, his voice low. "They say the mountain takes them, body and soul." "Enough," Abdiahu snapped. "We're here to uncover the truth, not to indulge in superstition." But as the night turned on, neither could he negate the strange incidences. Fire was flickering in an abnormally weird and was casting own shadows. Gad swore he heard that someone was stamping in snow, but when he looked, it was nowhere present. Then they heard the scream. It sounded like nothing humanly possible, piercing, shrill, inhumane, with pain. This scream echoed over the valley, immobile the people. "What was that?" Shlomith asked, her voice barely audible. Abdiahu stood, his heart pounding. "We're not alone." By morning, the group was shaken but determined to press on. They followed an ancient path carved into the mountainside, guided by markings on the map. As they climbed higher, they came upon a crumbling stone archway covered in strange symbols. "This is it," Abdiahu said, his voice tinged with excitement. "The gateway mentioned in the manuscript. Beyond this lies the heart of the mountain." Reuben hesitated. "Are we sure about this? That scream last night. Whatever made it, I don't want to meet it." "We've come too far to turn back now," Abdiahu replied. As they stepped through the archway, an oppressive darkness seemed to close in around them. The air grew colder, and the flickering shadows seemed more pronounced. The group moved cautiously, every sound amplified in the eerie silence. Then they saw it. It started as just a flicker of movement out of the corner of their eyes. But the further they advanced, the shadow grew clearer. A tall, human-shaped figure which seemed to ripple and shimmer like smoke. "What is that?" Shlomith whispered, her voice trembling. "The shadow," Abdiahu replied, his breath visible in the icy air. The figure did not move toward them, but it was there, watching. It shifted and flickered, its form like a thing that barely existed on the edge of reality. Nightfall brought the group to a cave marked on the map. Inside, they found what they feared, the remains of a previous expedition. Skeletons lay scattered on the floor, their bones twisted and broken. Among the bones, Abdiahu discovered a journal, its pages yellowed with age. The entries told of the expedition's descent into madness as they encountered the shadow. "It is not of this world," one entry read. "It sees into your soul, feeding on your fears. There is no escape." Shlomith looked at Abdiahu, her eyes wide with fear. "We shouldn't be here. This place is cursed." Before Abdiahu could say anything, the flickering shadow appeared at the entrance of the cave. Its presence filled the air with an unbearable weight, and the group realized too late that they had ventured into something far beyond their comprehension. The cold was alive, malevolent and biting, a living thing that crawled into their bones and sucked away what little hope they had left. The group sat huddled in the cave, breathing heavy in the ice-cold air. The shadow was gone, and the silence left behind seemed far more chilling than its presence ever was. "What was that thing?" whispered Gad, his voice barely above a whisper. Abdiahu didn't respond right away. Instead, he sat cross-legged on the ground and opened the ancient journal from the cave's remains before him. His hands quivered as he flipped through the yellowed pages with the dim light from a flickering lantern deciphering the faded script. "It's not just a legend," he finally said, his voice low but steady. "The shadow is real, and it's more than just a spirit. It's something ancient, something that predates even the stories we've heard." Reuben stood by the entrance of the cave, sword at the ready. "If that's true, then we need to leave. Now, whatever that thing is, it doesn't want us here." "No," Abdiahu said firmly, standing. "We've come too far. This journal, it holds clues to what the shadow is and how to stop it." Shlomith shook her head, her face pale. "Stop it?" Abdiahu, We're just scholars and explorers. We don't even know if it can be stopped." "We'll never know unless we try," he said, his features hardening into determination. "The journal mentions a temple further up the mountain. That's where we'll find our answers." Yehoash snorted. "You're mad. Every step we take closer to that temple is a step closer to death." "And yet you'll guide us," Abdiyahu said, meeting his gaze. For a moment, no one spoke. Then Yehoash sighed, the lines on his weathered face deepening. "You're paying me well, but don't expect me to die for your curiosity." With first light, they pushed forward, their breath plumed in the freezing air. The ancient track narrowed and worsened, snaking along the edge of a sheer cliff face. Below, the forest extended as a sea of shadows. Above, a peak loomed through the mist. The silence was oppressive. Even the wind seemed muted, as if the mountain itself conspired to muffle their presence. It wasn't long before the first signs of the shadow's influence began to show. "Do you hear that?" Gad asked, pausing mid-step. "Hear what?" Shlomith replied, glancing around nervously. "It's a voice," he said, his eyes darting to the shadows that clung to the rocks. "Whispering my name." "There's nothing there," Reuben said, his grip on his sword tightening. "Keep moving." But Gad wasn't convinced. He lagged behind, his eyes fixed on the shadows as though he could see something the others couldn't. The whispers grew louder as they climbed, filling the air with an almost musical quality. Abdiyahu heard them too, soft, melodic, and strangely familiar. "It's trying to lure us," he muttered to himself, forcing his eyes forward. By midday, they reached a plateau where the ruins of an ancient temple stood, its stone walls blackened with age. Strange symbols were etched into the stone, their patterns twisting and turning like the shadows that surrounded them. "This is it," Abdiyahu said, his voice a mix of awe and dread. Reuben approached the temple's entrance cautiously, his sword at the ready. "What kind of place is this?" "An altar," Abdiyahu said, running his fingers over the symbols. "The journal mentioned this place as the origin of the shadow. It's where the curse began." The group entered the temple, the air inside thick and suffocating. The walls were covered in carvings that depicted scenes of rituals, sacrifices, and a shadowy figure rising above a kneeling crowd. And there, at the very center of the room, sat a stone pedestal, and upon that rested a blackened orb that pulsed faintly with light. "This must be it," Abdiyahu said, moving forward. "Don't touch it," Shlomith warned sharply. Too late, however. Abdiyahu's hand had barely brushed against the orb before a wave of darkness erupted from it, shrouding the room in darkness. The darkness engulfed them, and the group was thrown into chaos. When the light returned, they found themselves in a place that defied explanation, a void where the ground seemed to ripple like water, and the sky was a swirling mass of shadows. The shadow stood before them, its form flickering and shifting. It spoke, though its voice was not a sound but a presence that filled their minds. "You want to know me, but you don't know the price," it said. Abdiyahu moved forward, his fear turning into a desperate curiosity. "What are you? Why do you haunt this place?" "I am the reflection of humanity's sins," the shadow replied. "Born of blood and betrayal. You cannot destroy me, for I am tied to your very existence." Shlomith clutched Abdiyahu's arm. "We have to go. This is beyond us." But Abdiyahu was entranced. "If you are a reflection, then there must be a way to expel you. Every curse has an antidote." The shadow's form writhed in convulsive spasms, its laughter ringing in their minds. "To expel me is to face the fact of your race. Are you ready for that?" The group found themselves in the temple once again, gulping for air. The orb lay broken on the ground, its dark energy seeping through the cracks. "We need to leave," Reuben said, his voice trembling. "No," Abdiyahu said, gazing at the carvings. "The shadow isn't just a curse. It's a reflection of something we've done. Something tied to this place. What do you mean? Shlomith asked. Abdiyahu pointed to the carvings. These rituals, they weren't to summon the shadow. They were to bind it. Someone released it, and we have to find out why. As night fell, the group discovered a hidden chamber beneath the temple. Inside, they found an ancient altar stained with blood. A single name was etched into the stone, Yehoachaz. The journal mentioned this name, Abdiyahu said, his voice trembling. He was a governor, a tyrant who ruled this region centuries ago. The shadow, it's tied to him. Shlomith's face paled. If the shadow was created by his actions, then how do we stop it? Abdiyahu didn't answer. Instead, he knelt by the altar, his mind racing. The answer would be in the carvings, in the rituals the ancients had performed to contain the shadow. But studying the markings on the altar walls, a quieter than usual chatter started returning again, louder than before. They were no longer alone. The shadow had returned. The oppressive silence in the secret chamber was only broken by the sound of shallow, panicked breathing. Abdiyahu knelt by the blood-stained altar, his fingers tracing the ancient name carved into its surface. The air around him seemed to throb with some unseen force, as if the mountain itself held its breath. Behind him, Shlomith gripped Gad's arm tightly, her nails digging into his sleeve. "We shouldn't be here," she whispered. Her voice quivered with fear, but no one responded. Yehoash, standing near the crumbling entrance to the chamber, muttered a curse under his breath. "I've had enough of this. Whatever answers you're looking for, Abdiyahu, they're not worth our lives." Abdiyahu didn't look up. "We're closer than ever to understanding this curse. If we leave now, we'll never know the truth." "The truth?" Yehoash spat. "The truth won't save us when that thing comes back." Reuben, standing guard by the stairs leading back into the temple, stiffened suddenly. He half-turned his head. His hands, gripping the sword tight in them, seemed to flex in preparation for a blow. "It's here," he breathed. Everyone was motionless. The flickering shadows at the edge of the chamber began to writhe, stretching and coiling like living things. The temperature plummeted, and the air grew heavy, making it difficult to breathe. Then, from the darkness, came the voice. "You cannot escape me," it whispered, soft and venomous. A surge of panic swept through the group. Shlomith stumbled back, dragging Gad with her, while Yehoash unsheathed his blade, though his hands trembled. "Stay together!" Reuben shouted, standing between the group and the encroaching darkness. But the shadows would not stop. They poured into the chamber like ink, devouring the faint light from the lanterns. Abdiyahu stood transfixed, his eyes fixed on the altar. The name carved into the stone seemed to glow faintly, as if reacting to the presence of the shadow. "Abdiyahu!" Shlomith screamed. "Do something!" The voice grew louder this time and reverberated through their minds. "You're seeking answers that do not exist. You're trespassers in a realm not even your own." Abdiyahu's mind rushed with it. Rituals, incantations that bind the shadow. Yet these were but parts, and no one ever detailed further. Abdiyahu held up the lantern close to the carvings on the wall. He tried his luck once again, in case there is another clue for them to move along. "There's a way to stop it," he yelled. "But we need time." "We don't have time," Yehoash sneered, chopping at the oozing darkness. His sword sliced through without any effort. He cursed again. The shadows collected into a shape, a monstrous, towering figure which towered above the group. Its eyes, or what passed as such, burned with malevolence. Reuben stepped forward, his sword raised. "Go! I'll hold it off." "No!" Shlomith screamed. "We have to stay together." But Reuben didn't listen. He charged at the shadow, his sword shining faintly in the dim light. The creature moved with inhuman speed, dodging his strike and retaliating with a swipe of its claw-like appendage. Reuben was thrown across the chamber, slamming into the wall with a sickening thud. "Reuben!" Gad shouted, rushing to his side. Reuben groaned, holding at his ribs. "I am okay," he wheezed. "Concentrate on the shadow." Abdiyahu's fingers skimmed over lines and lines of writing on the altar. This lot was special. It was deeper and more obvious, like these ones were purpose-made. The entry in the journal came suddenly. "A symbol of confinement holds the trick. Blood binds." "It must have blood," Abdiyahu spoke very low. Shlomith turned her attention to him with wide, bewildered eyes. "What?" "To bind the shadow," he said, his voice shaking. "The ritual requires a blood offering." Yehoash looked at him incredulously. "Are you mad? You expect us to—" He never got to finish. The shadow launched itself at them, its form writhing like a flame in the wind. Shlomith shrieked as it came for her, its claws inches from her face. Without thinking, Abdiyahu grabbed a dagger from his belt and slashed his palm. Blood dripped onto the altar, and the carvings began to glow with an eerie light. The shadow recoiled, its form distorting as though in pain. "It's working!" Abdiyahu shouted. "Keep it distracted!" The group fought desperately to keep the shadow at bay. Yehoash and Reuben, despite their injuries, used their swords to keep it from reaching Abdiyahu. Gad hurled rocks at the creature, though they passed through it harmlessly. Abdiyahu traced the glowing symbols with his blood, reciting the incantation from the journal. The words felt foreign on his tongue, as though they belonged to another time, another world. The shadow howled. Its voice sounded like a cacophony of rage and despair. Ground shook beneath them, and walls of the chamber began to crack. "Abdiyahu, hurry!" Shlomith cried. "I am almost done," he replied with a strained voice. The final words of the incantation left his lips, and the altar erupted in a blinding light. The shadow let out a piercing scream as it was pulled toward the glowing symbols, its form twisting and writhing in agony. For a moment, it seemed as though they had won. But then, the light faded, and the shadow was gone. The group stood in stunned silence, their breaths ragged. "It's over," Shlomith whispered, her voice shaking. Abdiyahu shook his head. "Number it's not." He pointed to the altar, where the name Yehoachaz had been superseded by a new one. Abdiyahu. "What does that mean?" Gad asked, his voice laced with terror. Abdiyahu's face went white. "The binding ritual. It transfers the curse to the one who performs it. The shadow is bound again, but it's tied to me now." Shlomith took a step forward, tears streaming down her face. "There's got to be some other way. We can—" A low laugh cut her off. It was Abdiyahu's voice, but it was darker, colder. "The shadow is loose," he said, his lips curling into a smile that wasn't his. "It's awake, and it's hungry." The mountain seemed to shudder under the weight of its ancient secrets. The chamber where the shadow had been bound was now a mausoleum of dread, its air thick with an unseen malice that pressed down on the group like an invisible hand. Abdiyahu stood by the altar, his gaze hollow, his lips twisted into a mocking smile that didn't seem entirely his own. Others nervously exchanged a glance, taking short breaths. "Abdiyahu," Shlomith ventured cautiously. "You're scaring us. What is happening to you?" Abdiyahu's head tilted slightly, his eyes gleaming with an unnatural light. "What's happening to me?" he echoed with a mixture of curiosity and menace in his voice. "I thought you wanted answers. The shadow and I, we're one now." A collective gasp echoed through the chamber. Yehoash instinctively raised his blade, stepping between Abdiyahu and the others. "This isn't you," Reuben said, his voice firm but tinged with unease. "You're stronger than whatever this thing is. Fight it." Abdiyahu's laughter was low and chilling. "Fight it? You don't understand, do you? The shadow isn't just a curse. It's a force, older than any of us, older than this land itself. And now, It's free. The air cooled, and faint whispers began to fill the chamber. They seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, words in an ancient tongue that none of them understood, but that all felt deep in their bones. "We need to leave," Shlomith said, her voice breaking. "Whatever this is, we can't face it here." "And go where?" Gad asked, his voice sharp with fear. "The shadow is with us now. It won't stop." "It's worse than that," Abdiyahu said, his voice shifting into a deeper, more resonant tone. "It's hungry, and you're all such perfect offerings." His words sent a shiver through the group. But before anyone could answer, the ground beneath their feet cracked, splitting the altar in two. A swirling darkness poured out, engulfing Abdiyahu whole. "Run!" Reuben shouted, grabbing Shlomith's arm and pulling her toward the stairs. The others followed, their footsteps echoing in the stone corridor as the whispers behind them grew louder, angrier. The stairs twisted and turned, leading the group deeper into the mountain instead of back to the surface. The torches they carried flickered weakly, their light swallowed by the encroaching darkness. "Where are we going?" Shlomith cried, her voice panicked. "This isn't the way out. It's the only path." Reuben snapped, his jaw tight. Gad stumbled, nearly falling as the stone beneath his feet shifted unnaturally. "The mountain, it's alive," he whispered. "It's the shadow," Reuben said grimly. "It's playing with us." Behind them, a guttural roar echoed through the corridors, followed by a chilling laugh that was unmistakably Abdiyahu's. They stepped into a great chamber, its sides covered with primitive paintings. Such paintings told tales of a thriving civilization that flourished in the mountain's shadows. Priests in elaborate masks and headdresses were performing various rituals, their masks covering their features. In the center of everything was a strange, darkly amorphous figure surrounded by groveling worshippers. "It's the shadow," Shlomith whispered, her voice heavy with fear. "It's much more than that," Gad said, stepping forward to study the murals more closely. "Look at their faces. They're terrified. They did not worship the shadow of their own free will. They were made to." Reuben nodded grimly. This mountain wasn't just a home. It was a prison. The rituals weren't performed to honor the shadow. They were to hold it captive. "But they failed," Shlomith said, her eyes wide with realization. Yehoash, who had been scanning the cavern for threats, turned to the others. "We don't have time to admire ancient art. That thing is still coming, and Abdiyahu's with it." As if on cue, the air grew heavy again. The torches flickered and died, plunging the cavern into darkness. A deep, resonant voice filled the space, each word dripping with malice. "You cannot run, you cannot hide, you belong to me." A howling gust of wind swept her off her feet, and Shlomith let out a wail, as if she were being dragged toward the center of the cavern by an unseen hand. "Shlomith!" Reuben shouted as he ran to catch up, but when he reached her side, a dark wall rose to block his view, and he was repelled. The screams grew loud, then faded to silence. When the shadows receded, she was gone. "No!" Reuben bellowed, pummeling the stone floor with fists. Yehoash drew him to his feet. "She's gone," he said, his voice glacial. "If we don't keep moving, we'll be next." Reuben's eyes flamed with anger and grief, but he nodded. The rest of the group moved onward, every footstep heavy with fear. Corridors curled and twisted in on themselves. The mountains seemed to laugh at their attempts to flee. Gad stumbled again and fell to his knees. I can't do this," he said, tears streaming down his face. "Yes, you can," Yehoash said, pulling him up. "We've made it this far. We can't give up now." But Gad shook his head. "It's pointless. The shadow will take us all." Before anyone could respond, Abdiyahu's voice echoed through the corridor. "God," it said, dripping with false kindness. You don't have to be afraid. Come to me, and I'll make it quick." Gad froze, his eyes wide with terror. Then, before anyone could stop him, he turned and ran back the way they had come. "Gad, no!" Reuben shouted, but it was too late. The sound of Gad's screams filled the air, then abruptly ceased. Yehoash, Reuben, and Shlomith, now the only survivors, stumbled into another chamber. This one was smaller, its walls covered in writing. Unlike the murals, the text was in a language they could understand. "It's a prophecy," Reuben said, his voice trembling as he read the words aloud. "The shadow will rise again when the mountain seal is broken. Its power will consume the land, unless a willing sacrifice binds it once more." Reuben's face turned pale. "A willing sacrifice. That's the only way to stop it." Yehoash shook his head. There has to be another way." But Reuben's gaze was fixed on the altar in the center of the chamber. "I'll do it," he said, his voice resolute. Before anyone could protest, the walls of the chamber blew outward as the shadow surged in. Abdiyahu was at its center, his face twisted into a grotesque mockery of his former self. "You think you can stop me?" he sneered. "You're nothing but insects." Reuben stepped forward, his sword drawn. "Maybe, but even insects can sting. The book will conclude with the final confrontation battle where survivors meet the full strength of the shadow. Will it be enough sacrifice for Reuben, or the shadow will drag all of them into darkness?" The chamber was chaos incarnate. Shadows writhed like living serpents, their cold tendrils reaching for the remaining survivors. The very air crackled with a dark energy, and Abdiyahu, no longer himself, stood at the heart of it all, a grotesque vessel for the ancient curse. Reuben, Yehoash, and Shlomith hugged each other tight, their ragged gasps the only breathing sounds they made. The words etched on the walls haunted them. Willing sacrifice. Those 3 words were like a noose that tightened around all their necks. "What do we do?" Shlomith asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "We fight," Yehoash said, holding his blade tightly. "We end this here, or it ends us." Reuben, on the other hand, appeared absent-minded, gazing at the altar. "There's no fighting this," he whispered. "The shadow isn't a foe you can kill. It's a force, a curse. It can only be contained. And you believe sacrificing yourself will save us?" Yehoash sneered, his voice heavy with anger and desperation. "That's lunacy." "It's the only way," Reuben replied with a tone so calm and unyielding. Before they could argue further, Abdiyahu's voice boomed through the chamber, though it was laced with a guttural, otherworldly timbre. "Why resist?" he taunted. "You've seen what I can do. Surrender now, and I might let you live. For a while." The offer hung in the air like poison. "Don't listen to him," Shlomith said, her grip tightening on Reuben's arm. But Reuben came forward, determination set on his face. "You are right," he said. "I cannot stop you, but I can negotiate." Yehoash seized his shoulder and said in a low growl, "What do you think you are doing?" "Buying time," Reuben said, wriggling free. He took a step forward to Abdiyahu, whose corrupted form loomed over him. "Take me," Reuben said, his voice steady. "You said you needed a vessel. I'll be your host, but only if you let the others go." Abdiyahu tilted his head, the twisted grin on his face spreading wide. "A noble gesture. But do you think you can outwit me, little man?" "It's not about outwitting you," Reuben said. "It's about giving them a chance." While Reuben had Abdiyahu facing him, Yehoash and Shlomith exchanged a glance. "He is buying time. But what do we have for?" whispered Shlomith. "What to do?" The eyes of Yehoash shifted through the space, on this time hitting upon the altar. The inscriptions on the walls spoke about some ritual. To again bind the shadow, but with such a thing they needed to be made as an offering. Only one can that be voluntary, done for love and fearlessness. It has to be him, Yehoash said grimly. No, Shlomith said, shaking her head. There has to be another way. There isn't, Yehoash said, but we can make sure his sacrifice isn't in vain. Reuben stood before Abdiyahu, his arms outstretched. Take me and release them, he said again. The shadow surged forward, its tendrils wrapping around him. Pain exploded through Reuben's body, but he didn't flinch. Run, he shouted to the others. Instead, Yehoash and Shlomith rushed to the altar. They started reciting the words on the walls, their voices shaking but determined. The shadow froze, its attention snapping to them. What are you doing? Abdiyahu roared, his voice echoing with fury. Finishing what you started, Yehoash said, his voice defiant. The ritual needed a willing participant, and as the words reached their climax, it became clear what needed to happen. Still entwined by the shadow, Reuben faced Yehoash and Shlomith. Do it, he urged, his voice shaking but firm. Finish the ritual. No, Shlomith shrieked. There's got to be another way. There isn't, Reuben replied calmly. This is my choice, my sacrifice. Through streaming tears, Shlomith said the last words. A blinding light filled the chamber, and the shadow screamed, its form unraveling as it was pulled toward the altar. Reuben's body glowed with an otherworldly radiance as he became the anchor for the binding. Thank you, he whispered, his voice barely audible. And then he was gone. In silence, the light died. Chamber. The shadow disappeared, imprisoned as before. Abdiyahu's body sprawled out, his features composed, the agony of bearing the terrible thing done with, a burden put away. Stiffly and still, Shlomith and Yehoash stood over that place in heavy silence. He did it, Shlomith whispered hardly audibly. He nodded tight at jaw level. He saved us. They made their way back up, the mountain eerily silent. As they broke into the chill of night, they gazed back up at the summit that had both held them prisoner and saved them. We can't let this ever happen again, Yehoash said. Shlomith nodded. We will, for Reuben. Years later, the mountain stood as it always had, its secrets buried deep within. Villagers spoke of strange lights and whispers, but no one dared venture too close. And deep within the chamber, the altar remained, its inscriptions glowing faintly. A single word was etched into the stone, a name, a reminder of the man who had given everything to protect the world from the darkness. Reuben. The story ends with a haunting finality and leaves one wondering for how long the seal would hold.